Hello, welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez and this is Interviews from Quito. In this program, we talk about the big challenges that Ecuador and the region are facing. Today, we will analyze new economic measures by the government of Ecuador. Layoffs, privatizations, gasoline prices going up, and all of this in the middle of a pandemic. Workers say none of the measures will help fight COVID-19, but they will please the IMF. And the government says there's too much spending for education and social issues. So could Ecuador be on the brink of another mobilization to demand an end to this government in response to the measures? For that, we have Emilio Uzcategui, economist and lawyer in Quito. Hello, Emilio. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Carla. Greetings to all our viewers, and thank you for this space.
So first, the most pressing matter. Almost 10,000 people in Ecuador will be losing their jobs. How is this supposed to help the country?
This is definitely not going to help the country in any way. Why? First of all, we have to understand that Ecuador's economy used to grow because of household expenditure. That means that middle-class people had more available income, and that allowed them to do some additional spending. Besides, they also had education and public health guaranteed, so that was more money available for them, which translated in more money for small businesses that sell more and more taxation in the context of the whole economy. So reducing the salaries, even for public workers and even for private workers, would be terrible for Ecuadorian economy, would mean that we will delay the recuperation from the virus at least 2 to 4 years. So it's terrible, really laying off workers in this situation. Besides the moral implications it has, it's also technically contrary to what the Ecuador needs.
So you were mentioning the issue of the workers. Part of these measures imposed by the government says that now public workers have to work less hours, have to receive less money. And what does that mean for their social security? Will that mean less pay for that too?
Well, what happened was that President Moreno emitted a decree that reduced the working hours of public workers, but it is not compulsory. So what I mean by this? What Moreno did was reform the reglementation of our labor law to allow the reduction of hours for public workers. That means that every public institution will have to go through a process to decide which of the workers get reduced or which don't. Okay, so anyway, the savings that they were planning to make with this measure, I see them as something very complicated. And if they do so, if they do what they're planning to do, it will mean a reduction from 25% to 65% on the salary of almost 1 million public workers in Ecuador. So that will have a very, very bad effect for the economy.
And now Moreno is saying that, of course, to handle this issue, this economic issue, there will be a credit available in a state bank at a 5% rate, a couple of other measures. But would that be enough for people that have lost their job during this pressing moment, especially since the previous labor law had them receive money from what the law said that they were owed for the amount of years that they were working in their previous jobs, but now with the new law, they won't receive what they owe for constitutional rights.
Well, the credits are designed to reactivate the economy. However, it's going to be really difficult to do so because most of the small businesses won't have access to a credit because they won't have enough sales. So you don't go into debt if you know that you're going to sell less in your business. So it's a change, you know. We might have available credit, but nobody is going to get in debt knowing that high for an emergency situation, you know. That's exactly why you would need public banking in order to reduce those interest rates. However, I still see, I can clearly see that the view of the government is to create these credits via the private banking. And the private banking has a for-profit criteria. So it's very probable that these credits won't have the effect that the government is expecting.
And Emilio, there's also another economic issue. There's continuing to be a privatization program by Moreno. He's closing public media, rail lines, the post office of Ecuador. What's going to happen now with those companies? Are they going to cease to exist, or will they pass to a private hand?
Well, these decisions have two different aspects. Some of those companies, the less profitable, are going to be definitely closed. So all their employees are going to be laid off. That is not exactly a privatization process rather than just the closure of those companies. These companies, even though if they were not very profitable, they fulfilled some essential services for Ecuador. For example, we have the mail office. Imagine a country closing its post office and pays them with our tax money, and the business, the good business and the good profits go to private hands. So it's a very sinister process of privatization. I don't think it's a regular and normal process as we have seen before in Latin America during the 90s or 80s. I think this is even more aggressive.
And also, Emilio, there's the issue of the gasoline prices, because we saw in October 2019 that there were large mobilizations against just the announcement of a possible rise in gasoline prices. And now that the president is saying that it will go up, could this trigger a larger protest?
Well, in the aspect of the gasoline prices, what they have done is replaced the fixed price with the subsidy and change it for a range of prices. This range of prices is going to vary depending on the international prices of oil. So the political idea behind it is that right now the prices are not going up because the global oil prices are low. However, when the prices in the international markets reach their balance, the gasoline for Ecuadorians is going to be much higher than it used to be before. So in the practice, for practical effects, what they are doing is dismantling the subsidy. And the strategy behind this is that, of course, since now we're all locked up due to the COVID crisis, there's no social reaction towards this measure, even though some indigenous sectors have claimed that they will take political actions in the streets and go to protests if they dismantle the subsidy systems for gas. However, this is very complicated right now, since these are important articulations between indigenous sectors and popular political leaders here in the capital cities. And that articulation is pretty important to have a big protest that could make Moreno take a step back.
So if people cannot go to the streets or are less encouraged to go to the streets because of the lockdown measures and safety measures as well to prevent more infections of COVID-19, what can people do? Can they organize through online meetings, or what can they do to demand for their rights?
You know, I think that people can and need, and it's very important that we go to protests now. We can do it with all the precautions and all the measures to make it safe. It's been done in other countries. In Chile, we saw some demonstrations respecting the social distancing and taking all the necessary measures. And there's also even a resolution from a German court saying that the right of protest is not limited by the lockdown due to COVID. So the real problem is that even though we can do it, people are really scared. You know, the people are mainly concerned about three things right now: COVID, their jobs, and the reduction of their salaries. So in that line of thought, it's very complicated. It's possible, but it's very complicated.
And the issue of the IMF in Ecuador, we still haven't discussed that, and some people are still a little bit doubtful about what is really going on between the Ecuadorian state and the IMF. Do we still have their bailout money? Do we still need them? Are these measures being implemented only following what the International Monetary Fund wants from the country?
Well, to be honest, if a government has a real sense of sovereignty, it would never need of the IMF. It would just take the economic and political measures that are needed to get out of the crisis. For example, taxing the richest people in the country, avoiding tax havens, that kind of stuff. Of course, that's not the case in Ecuador. The IMF is still in the core of the government, of Moreno's government. So what's going to happen right now is that the IMF is going to accelerate its agenda in Ecuador. And that's why right now they come with this whole package of reducing the public salaries, laying off public workers. I think there is a regional aspect that hasn't been talked about, and is that right now most neoliberal governments that are ruling Latin America have changed their focus and their management of their countries towards a model that benefits debt with international organizations such as the IMF. So what this means in practical terms is that Latin America will only get over the crisis when the IMF wants so. The dangers of that is that we are geopolitically strangled right now. We don't have any sovereign regional stance like UNASUR would have been to get out of the crisis. So basically all of Latin America right now is for sale and is being sold by the IMF. It's a very, very dangerous and complex situation for Latin America.
And do you believe that other sectors might be involved in this cutback? Because the government is talking about $4 billion that need to be cut from social investment. I will say investment. The country says social spending, which means a totally different thing.
I agree with you that social spending is always really social investment. However, I do think there are some different agendas than those of the IMF that are currently operating with Moreno's government. One of those agendas that we can see clearly is the agenda of the financial sectors, of the local financial elites. And what does this mean is that while banks are having huge profit margins in the middle of the crisis, they will also be the ones who will control the credit to get out of the crisis. So what that really means is that the banks are going to basically own all of the Ecuadorian economy. There's a separation, there's a violent split between the real economy of Ecuador and the financial economy of Ecuador. And in that sense, the banks are also, with the IMF, in the core of Moreno's policies.
And have you read or have you known any of the, for example, the chambers of commerce in Ecuador, have they have any proposals on a different way to apply these cutbacks? For example, you were mentioning taxing the rich or other things that could be applied instead of cutting education, cutting health, cutting jobs and more.
Well, the production chambers have always had the idea that salaries are too high in Ecuador, that the dollarization doesn't allow us to compete with our neighbors such as Colombia and Peru. So I think that this exception regime that Moreno created for the private workers to reduce also their salaries and to create these very small apportations for really big businesses, I think that's part of the chambers of commerce. However, I think that they are pretty divided in this aspect. Why? Because exporters such as banana producers and that kind of stuff, and the other is importers that are dedicated to commerce here in Ecuador. And both of them have very different interests. So in that aspect, I think that there's been also a pretty intense and very secret conflict between these different groups and the financial sector in the economic agenda of President Moreno. So I don't think they really agree on it all, but they don't have a proposal of their own. We have not seen here any big banking, any big industrial sector saying, okay, it's time to tax the rich, which we have seen in other countries. In Europe, this is happening, and this is happening with the request of the big businesses. I mean, it's not a thing of ideology, it's not a thing of doctrine. It's what is technically needed to do to get out of the crisis. And we are not doing that. And we are not seeing that in Ecuador or in the rest of Latin America.
And you were mentioning the high salaries, or at least the idea of high salaries, because it's very interesting to analyze what the government said in their press conference, that they're closing embassies and diplomatic offices, because a lot of people were complaining about the high salaries from diplomatics around the world. But especially Moreno mentioned Venezuela, Iran, and Nicaragua, and also the Andean Parliament. So could this be an economic decision, or would you say it's more of a political one?
I think that kind of, the savings they would get from closing our diplomatic representations in those countries are minimum. I mean, they're not significant at all. They are not necessary to get out of the crisis. However, you can definitely see a political undertone on those decisions, and it's getting away from this global bloc that it's uncomfortable, especially for the US and for the IMF, get far away from them and try to establish new international relations closer to our new geopolitical and international allies, which would be only the USA and some NGOs.
And there's also talk among politicians and economists, of course, that there might be a muerte cruzada, which means like the government seizing the assembly and vice versa. So could this be the legal situation ahead for the political class in Ecuador?
Well, first of all, in order to go to the muerte cruzada, as you mentioned, there's a constitutional requirement, and is that you cannot do that before 1 year of the end of the government period. So we're about to fulfill that year. So if there's an option for muerte cruzada, it should be a mechanism that would be activated in the next weeks. Personally, I see that I don't see that as a possibility. And why I don't see it as a possibility? Because the National Assembly, the Congress in Ecuador, is not in a straight opposition to President Moreno. The best example for that is that the two economic emergency laws sent by Moreno in the previous month were approved. They were approved with only the refusal or the contrary votes of small sectors in the parliament, like the Revolución Ciudadana, which is the political movement close to the former president Rafael Correa, and the Partido Social Cristiano, which is a party that is aligned with the interests, especially of exporters and agro-industrial entrepreneurs in the coast of Ecuador. So the rest of them, of most congressmen, are directly representatives of the executive branch. They are pretty close to Lenin Moreno. They are pretty close to Maria Paula Romo, which is the person that is negotiating the votes on the Congress for President Moreno. So I don't see it necessary for Moreno to dismantle the Congress. However, if the measures, if they want to take deeper measures, the assembly could be a future problem, and they would probably activate this mechanism. However, they don't have much time because of this constitutional provision we have of the year before elections.
And that was exactly my next question. We have elections in 2021. How do you see the electoral movement? What's going to happen with former President Rafael Correa? There's talks about the vice president, the current vice president, Otto Sonnenholzner, also running. There's other parties that are trying to get it also in the fight. What's going to happen to Ecuador?
That's a very complex question that I would like to answer from hope rather than from reality. And it's that I truly, honestly expect that former President Rafael Correa, or at least a candidate close to its movement, at least can be able to participate in elections, because this is another problem with our current democracy, and is that all the democratic instances are taken also by President Moreno, by people close to the executive branch. And that means that they won't let us participate. They won't let some certain parties participate in the elections of 2021. We can already see that. I mean, they're threatening the Compromiso Social, which is the political party where the people that are close to Rafael Correa are participating. They're planning to ban it. They have threatened them in various ways. So I do think that if they would let, if we have a material democracy, and former President Rafael Correa or some of the congressmen close to him would participate, I think it would be very probable that they would win. However, I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen, because I really don't think they're going to let them participate. So the other options we have is Otto Sonnenholzner. Otto Sonnenholzner is presented as this new young candidate, which really represents the most rancid and old fashion of the right wing, of the Ecuadorian right wing. I mean, it's just a new face, but the policies and his political ideas and his group of power, it's the group of power that has always governed Ecuador. So that wouldn't be a good option to get out of the crisis. I think it's time, it would be an interesting time during the elections for an outsider candidate that could be able to get to attract to him all these voters that are really pissed off at Moreno. There's this social ambience of sadness, of depression. There's a very marked political hate towards a political class. So people are, I mean, it's really hard to really make a diagnosis of what's going to happen in 2021 because COVID changes everything, because we don't have electoral judges that guarantee the same conditions for every party. So it's very complex to make an analysis in that sense. However, I want to have hope, and I want to think that things will probably change in 2021. There will be a new regime, and a lot of these policies we've been talking about will be dismissed.
Indeed, we have hope as well. Leave the country a little bit more beat up than what we are at the moment.
Well, the corruption discourse has played an interesting role during all of Moreno's government. And it's basically the corruption discourse was used to disqualify and to persecute all of its political contraries. However, right now, we can really see where the corruption really is at. And it's very sad, you know, lots of cases of overpriced buying of health, of masks and all these things that are really necessary to overcome the crisis. And most of them are related to the close circle of President Moreno. And by that, I mean people like Maria Paula Romo, like Juan Sebastián Roldán, people that are close to the group of power of Otto Sonnenholzner. So it looks like the corruption is only persecutable and it's only bad when it's a political enemy. But when it's Moreno and the people close to the circle of power, it's not that bad. And we can see there also former President Abdallah Bucaram. There's been a lot of corruption scandals related to his sons that have been negotiating their participation in the Congress and votes in the Congress with Maria Paula Romo and receiving in exchange space. Really, really a sad situation.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Emilio, for your time to discuss these topics.
Thank you, Carla. Goodbye to everybody, and a warm hug from Ecuador. And I hope the best for us all. We're having a really tough time, so stay strong, stay close, and stay always near to Latin America. Bye.
Thank you, Emilio. So we've been talking to Emilio Uzcategui, economist and lawyer in Quito, about the economic austerity imposed by the government amid the COVID-19 pandemic and how this will affect an already struggling society. Thank you for watching. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.